Chapter 8. Equestria's eyes flashed open at the sound of somebody nearby. A hand covered her mouth, blocking any sound she might make. Struggling fiercely, she tried to espy her assailant. "Equestria, it's me." Letting go of her mouth, he put a finger to his lips, a signal for her to stay quiet. "Get up. We must go. Now," he hissed. "What's going on, Pantheus?" Moving quickly to get out of bed, she stopped short, realizing her nightgown was missing. Confusion crinkled her brow as she tried to recall why. And then she did, with jolting impact. Keeping an eye on the door, Pantheus grabbed her clothing, which the maid had washed, folded, and placed neatly on top of the dresser several hours earlier. Tossing the clothes at her, he seized her belongings and opened a secret panel in the wall. "Get dressed. We don't have much time." Pantheus disappeared into the concealed passageway. Feeling the effects of her evening, Equestria dressed quickly and attempted to comb her hair, which was in complete disarray. In the end, she decided her hair would wait and took the comb with her. Adjusting her sword on her belt, she dashed through the panel. Pantheus closed it behind her. A long, dismal corridor stretched out ahead of them. Mortar and debris covered the floor, and dusty cobwebs encumbered the walls and ceiling. Evidently, this passage wasn't used regularly. "Pantheus, what's going on? Where's my sister?" "Werner is here, with a unit of Cyrenian soldiers. They barged in just after dawn. They've come for us." "Do they have Kessa?" Seizing a lit torch from a wall sconce, Pantheus bent to retrieve an unlit one from the ground. Lighting it, he passed it to Equestria. "I had to use this passage to get to you before they did. This way. Hurry." "Where's Kessa?" she demanded. "Malleus has her." His tone, sharp and edged with fury, prevented her from asking further questions as they rushed down a narrow, circular staircase. Malleus had Kessa? With his usual uncanny skill, he'd managed to remove Kessa from the room without her noticing. Kessa had been in the bed when she'd fallen asleep, but not when she'd awoken. How did he manage to keep Kessa captive, much less quiet, during the time he'd spent with her? Shame and regret hit her hard now, especially since she'd been warning Pantheus about the powerful seduction of the night, a power she, herself, had plainly succumbed to. The sleeping draught she'd taken, that Pantheus had cautioned her against, hadn't helped. But even with her sister captured, and soldiers in close pursuit, she couldn't help feeling as though things weren't as bad as they seemed. And she couldn't bring herself to entirely regret the time she'd spent with Malleus either. It had consoled and healed her. Closing her eyes tightly, she recalled her husband's last words before he'd left her mere hours ago. "No matter what happens, Equestria, know that I love you. I will always love you." Knowing what he was doing and was about to do, he wanted to leave her with that message. It shouldn't have been comforting, given present circumstances, but it was. It was like falling through the ice of a frozen lake, being pulled out and having a woolen blanket wrapped around you. You don't think it will warm you, but it does. Still, if Malleus had Kessa, then it was finished. Kessa was finished. It was highly unlikely she'd escape, and even more unlikely that anyone would succeed in rescuing her. They were finished. Rake is waiting for us with a couple of horses, Pantheus announced, interrupting her thoughts. Leading her down another treacherous staircase, around a sharp corner, and down an elongated corridor, he stopped at what appeared to be a dead end. Passing her his torch, Pantheus reached up and pressed a protruding brick back into place. There was a loud click, and, still holding the brick in place, he pushed the wall. Nothing happened. Grumbling, Pantheus shoved his shoulder against it, but it didn't budge. "Do you blame me, Pantheus?" Equestria asked suddenly. He strained against the unmoving wall. "Hold the brick, please." Once Equestria held the brick in place, Pantheus stepped back before ramming full force into the wall, and with a scraping protest, it budged. "Great," Pantheus growled, thrusting against the barrier with all his might. Holding the torch away from them, Equestria helped push until a narrow gap appeared, allowing them through. Beyond the opening, the corridor continued for a stretch, and then ended in a concealed exit. Negotiating the jagged boulders outside, Pantheus observed their surroundings. The sun, bathing the eastern sky in orange, pink, and purple hues, had barely risen above the trees, and the air was chilly, fragrant with the smell of pre-dawn rain. Huge boulders and jagged rocks dotted the hill descending from the outer wall of the castle, and the tall, yellow grass, still wet from rain, wouldn't make navigating any easier. Offering his hand to Equestria, Pantheus finally replied to her earlier question. "Blame is pointless, Equestria. It accomplishes nothing. I just want her back, alive. That's all I care about." "Me too." Her foot slipped on a moss-covered rock, and, rebalancing herself with the help of his hand, she looked straight into his concerned face. "Tell me he won't hurt her." A tremor shook her body, and her gaze shifted from his imploring blue eyes to the uneven, rocky terrain. She wanted nothing more than to assure him that Malleus wouldn't hurt or allow anyone else to hurt Kessa. "I can't. Pantheus, the best way we can help Kessa now is to swallow our fears and emotions and find out what he has planned so we can thwart it." "What are our chances?" Her brow furrowed. "Fair," she lied, letting go of his hand. Following her own advice, she mastered her emotions, trudged down the hill, and entered the woods. She saw Rake leaning against a tree, watching 3 horses as they munched grass without a care in the world. How far things had spiraled, Equestria mused, if she was finding herself envious of a horse's life. Huddled in the corner of her cell, Kessa watched warily as he approached her cage. She'd awoken in what she could only assume was Aquina's prison, without a clue how she'd gotten there. Her cell was the last one in a string of stone cubicles, fronted by impenetrable cylindrical iron bars. Filthy, soggy straw was piled against the back wall in the form of a bed, adding its own distinct stench to the foul smell of the place. A grimy bucket was filled with a liquid that only faintly resembled water, and pieces of the previous occupants' discarded, rock-hard bread were scattered around the floor for the rats to nibble. Horrible coughing, sneezing, and teeth chattering echoed throughout the prison, courtesy of the icy temperatures and lack of blankets. Tiny holes in the walls, serving as windows, provided inadequate light to do anything other than shiver in the cold. The prison was dark, damp, dirty, utterly miserable, and with the anchored chain securing her ankle, completely inescapable. Not long after she'd woken, the guard, having heard her moving around, had stalked all the way to her cell, demanding silence, and supplemented his command with a beating. So she'd crouched there, silent and unmoving, until his arrival. Beholding her there, cramped against the wall, eyeing him suspiciously, Malleus was reminded of a cornered fox. The hint of malice that sparkled in her bright baby blues, regardless of her predicament, triggered the tremor of a smile. Noting this, Kessa lunged at him, both the chain and the bite on her leg momentarily forgotten. Taking a deliberate step back, he easily avoided her attack. The tremor of a smile became an obvious smirk. "A pleasure, as always, Miss Acara," he said. Clucking his tongue, he looked her up and down, observing her fresh welts and bruises. "The guards, as you are well aware, have a terrible habit of abusing prisoners unduly." He sighed derisively. "I really must talk to them about it sometime." Directing his attention down the hallway, he signaled to the guard, who'd just begun his shift, and ordered, "Open this cell." The guard, unknown to Kessa and obviously not one of Malleus's men, rushed to do his bidding, reminiscent of a puppy dog obeying its master, and then waiting for the pat of approval. Instructing the guard to relock the cell and wait down the hall until he was summoned, Malleus entered her cage. His diabolical grin widened as the prisoner recoiled, trying to get as far from him as possible. "Not so feisty now, eh?" Grabbing a fistful of her nightdress, he yanked her up and pinned her against the wall. He smoothed a fingertip over a red bruise on her cheek, causing her to wince, and his dark eyes gleamed. "So, tell me why he is so interested in you." Stunned, Kessa stared at him, daunted by the power behind his eyes and the sheer aura of supremacy that he exuded. Shivering, not from the cold, she stood motionless before him, a lamb to his lion. After a couple of moments, Kessa, remembering herself, summoned up her gumption and slapped his hand away. "I don't know." "Oh, Miss Acara," he said, his eyebrows contracting with annoyance. But then something made him freeze. He rotated his head ever so slightly to the right, as if listening intently. When his attention reverted, he warned, "Time is running out." Reaching beneath his cloak, he withdrew a bundle from his pack that Kessa recognized as her clothing. He dropped it at her feet. Something glinted in his hand, causing Kessa to blink. Her eyes were accustomed to the darkness of her cell, after all. The item glinted a second time, stinging her eyes. She wondered if he had ascertained her discomfort and was exploiting it for his own depraved pleasure. A third time answered that question. This time the bright flash stained her vision. Beseeching him to stop, she rubbed her eyes, and not wanting to give his childish ploy any more satisfaction, she didn't open them again for a while. Malleus called the guard, requesting he reopen the cell. "Get dressed, Acara. He'll be here soon." The guard clanked the cell door to a decisive close after her unwelcome guest had departed. Kessa mulled over her brother-in-law's strange and seemingly unnecessary warning. Of course her time was running out. She was on death row. And who would be there soon? Grabbing her clothing from the floor, she realized her ankle was free. During the brief time her eyes were closed, the dungeon keeper had unlocked her ankle manacle. Bewildered by his motives, she quickly changed, relieved to be out of her nightdress. Why had Lord Fane delivered her clothing and freed her leg? Did he want her to attempt an escape? Had he really bothered to pack her a change of clothes while he was snatching her from the castle? If anyone else had done that, she would have given them points for thoughtfulness. Not malicious, though. Kessa's thoughts turned to Pantheus, Rake, and her sister, and her initial confusion gave way to concern. If he hadn't harmed them, once her absence was noticed, they'd likely attempt a rescue. Malleus would be expecting, maybe even wanting, this, and that scared her. She remembered the way he'd made her feel just a couple moments earlier, and shivered again. In those few seconds, she'd viewed him like a dark messenger of death and destruction, a being who knew all schemes and plans were going according to his will, and that no one who opposed him would ever triumph. Knocking his cloak off his shoulders so that it hung limply from his neck, Malleus entered the jailer's office. The jailer stood at the window, ignoring the cooing pigeon on the sill. He was so intent on the spectacle outside that he was oblivious to Malleus's entrance. In plain view of the window, 4 majestic steeds, whinnying and stomping impatiently, were harnessed to a massive, ornately decorated carriage, which had just arrived. A well-attired footman jumped down from his perch and hurried to open the carriage door. Malleus pulled the jailer's chair toward himself with a loud scraping noise, jerking the man out of his observatory trance.
"Sir, the king is here,"
the jailer announced with considerable alarm.
"Here! What shall I do?"
Smiling congenially, Malleus reached for a feather pen, inkwell, and paper. Beginning to write, he suggested calmly, "Go and greet him."
"Greet him! Yes, of course,"
the jailer stammered, wiping his hands down his clothes, endeavoring to smooth the wrinkles and wipe away the dirt smudges. If this action had succeeded, it would have been astounding indeed. "Close the door behind you, please," Malleus instructed, concentrating on pen and paper. From outside, Malleus overheard the jailer's spluttered welcome and the king's harsh demand to see Fane. A minute later, the door slammed open and Cassius barged into the office. "Your Majesty," Malleus bowed his head. "What brings you to Aquina?" Sneering, Cassius barked, "Spare me, snake. You as much as summoned me." "I sent word that Kessa was captured and her sentence to be carried out." Yes, and you knew that would attract my attention, and you left just enough time for me to get here before her execution, didn't you? "It's the standard time for sentencing." Enough of this blathering. Take me to her, now. With precision, Malleus lowered his pen, folded the piece of paper, placed it in his pocket, stood up, tucked in his chair, and bent his head in assent at the king, who rolled his eyes, illustrating his annoyance at the delay. "This way, my liege." As soon as Kessa's location became apparent, Cassius shoved past Malleus and demanded the cell be opened. Seizing the key from the guard on his way to the cell, Malleus unlocked the door and followed the king inside. Kessa groaned upon seeing her new visitor. Intense fear stained her pretty features, and Malleus noted, with infinitesimal disdain, that she seemed more afraid of Cassius than of him. Both men towered over Kessa. At one time, the king's handsome features, from his dark blue eyes to his silky, soft, shoulder-length blue hair and chiseled frame, were enough to make her heart race with an inexplicable infatuation. Not any more, especially now that his features were contorted with rage and contempt. Now, if her heart was racing, it was due to fear. "Kessa Acara," he said, his voice matching the silkiness of his hair, though not fully concealing an undercurrent of wrath. "You've been a very naughty girl." He viciously backhanded her, sending her flying into the wall. It wouldn't be entirely true to say without warning, but it was certainly sudden. Lacking the strength or desire to stand, Kessa slouched where she'd landed, feeling as though 1,000 tiny lead balls had been injected into her limbs. Placing one hand firmly around her throat, Cassius used it to slide her up the wall until he'd reached the end of his arm's extension. Using his body to immobilize the rest of her, he growled scathingly. "You have any idea the trouble you've caused me?" He slammed her against the wall. "Where is it, you little thief?" Strangling, Kessa didn't reply. She couldn't, even if she'd wanted to. Tightening his grip, the king repeated his question, adding, "Tell me now, or I'll kill everything you love." Kessa was turning purple. Bright lights were beginning to flash in her eyes. But Cassius just held her there, watching her die. Catching movement out of the corner of his eye, he loosened his grip. "Where are you going, snake?" he asked furiously, seeing Malleus exiting the cell. Malleus looked surprised by the question. "I am going to cancel the public execution, sire." His eyes narrowing, Cassius snorted, a sound indicative of a command to stay put and explain. "Pardon my intrusion, my liege," Malleus said, "but I thought you'd decided to carry out her sentence here and now. If you keep choking her like that, the noose will be unnecessary." After a supercilious glance at his victim, the king accepted that the dungeon keeper was correct, and let go. Kessa fell to the ground, coughing and gasping for air. Cassius observed her malevolently, then swiveled back to Malleus, who said, "Allow me to interrogate her, sire. It is, after all, my area of expertise. Once I know the information you require, my wise and prudent king." Loathing this hollow fawning, the king spat in Malleus's direction and brutally kicked Kessa as if it were her fault. "Whatever it is Miss Acara stole from you," he cast a careful sideways glance at Cassius, "or denied you," he ducked the expected swing, "I'll return to you." "Just by me telling you what I want from her? That's simple. Why, because you think you can break her better than me?" "Precisely." As suddenly as it had started, the king's rage subsided, and he became thoughtful. Stroking his chin, his eyes scrutinizing Malleus, he nodded slowly. "You've never failed me, Fane." Cassius circled him like a vulture sizing up its next meal. "You'd ascertain what I want to know, regardless of your relation to her. You seem that ruthless. I've a more advantageous use for your skills, though." Folding his arms, Malleus adjusted his stance, and the paradigm altered from vulture circling meal to Venus flytrap and circling fly. "Oh?" "Word's reached me that Pantheus Aegeon still lives, and I have a nagging suspicion that since this area is where—" Cassius squinted at Kessa. and after briefly deliberating her overhearing, continued. Red Talon is strongest. Agian must be their elusive, pain-in-my-backside leader. I'm sure of it. Out of the numerous hunters, trackers, soldiers, and spies I've assigned to find and destroy Red Talon's leader, everyone has failed. But I've never given you the task, have I, Snake? Perhaps now that I've identified the leader, finding them should be even easier. Opening the door to the cell, Cassius looked directly at Malleus and instructed, As hunting is also your area of expertise, find and kill him for me. Kessa's stomach hollowed out as she digested the king's order, with no small amount of dread. Peering up at Malleus, commanding in his dark armor, which accentuated his solid muscles and probably concealed multiple weapons, Kessa's dread intensified. This vile predator ordered to destroy Pantheus? The thought tore at her insides as ferociously as a bear's claw. Cassius strode down the hall, his heavy footsteps pounding loudly, and his last words echoing. Kill them! Start with Kessa Decora. Somewhere on some outlying barnyard, a rooster crowed, signaling dawn's approach. Moments passed like hours as Kessa sat, her sore legs stretched out on the cold, dirt-packed floor, watching as the sun's rays eventually crept through the holes in the eastern wall of her cell. Dawn was never her favorite part of the day, but now, for obvious reasons, she loathed its coming more than ever. All night, while enduring the cold, lonely darkness and each ache of her battered body, she'd pondered her predicament and tried to figure out any possible escape. At one point in the wee hours when all was quiet, the gigantic tub of a guard, who'd been on duty since the king's arrival, approached her cell. The moment Kessa had laid eyes on him, she'd known he was a local thug. Guards under Malleus's command were required to maintain the utmost fitness, and they had a mental sharpness that was palpably beyond this reprobate. Shoving his torch amidst the bars, he'd sneered ruthlessly when the light revealed her huddled in the corner like a sitting duck. His unsavory intentions immediately clear, Kessa combed the cell for anything she could use to defend herself. Unsuccessful, she warned fiercely, Stay away from me. Now don't be like that, girlie. You die in the morning. Why not have a little fun tonight? Snickering, he'd placed the torch in an available wall bracket and twisted back to the cell. Hope you're not afraid of the dark, he'd rasped, his hand lowering to the side of his belt. He'd frozen momentarily, an expression of astonished confusion crossing his pig-like features. Looking down, he'd patted his hands along his belt, and Kessa had realized he was searching for his keys. Comprehension dawned on her several moments before it did him. Malleus had taken the key ring during Cassius's visit, and had neglected to return it. An oversight Kessa was extremely relieved by, and grateful for. If the guard had gained access to her cell, she'd have been at his mercy, and he clearly didn't have any. Thwarted, the guard had snarled a couple obscenities and viciously kicked the cell bars, leaving her alone for the remainder of the night. Now, jaw and neck in agony from Cassius's attack, bruises and welts from the previous guard's beating, and the bite on her leg making itself known, Kessa stood up and wrapped her fingers around the cell bars. She could hear Malleus censuring the guard for falling asleep, and knew he'd come for her. Her execution was to be carried out that morning. Quietly, she whispered a fervent oath of courage and took a steadying breath. "Ah, awake and ready, I see," Malleus assessed solemnly. He stood there waiting, and then, with marked impatience, he turned to the guard standing beside him. "Well, open the cell." The guard blinked. Malleus tapped his foot, having a synonymous effect to a ticked-off king cobra dispersing its hood.
Sir, you have my keys,
the guard spluttered timidly. "I do not. I returned them to you after the king left." "Pardon me, sir, but I think you—" "Your job isn't to think," Malleus drawled with conspicuous contempt. "It's to open this cell. Now." "I don't have the keys, sir. I don't know where they are," the heavy man yelped, swallowing hard, beads of sweat appearing on his thick forehead. "Go and find them." Unable to prevent a small squeak of fear from escaping his lips, the guard scurried away from Malleus like a rat fleeing the clutches of a ferret. He scampered back moments later, hurrying to unlock the cell door. "Apologies, the keys somehow fell under my desk." "Shackle her legs. She's slippery, and we shouldn't take any chances." Eyes wide as an owl's, the guard swallowed again, staring stupidly at his companion. Sighing exasperatedly, Malleus waved him away, watching as he rushed down the hallway to get the shackles. Quicker than before, chest heaving and pudgy face red with exertion, the guard returned with the shackles and immediately secured them to Kessa's ankles. "Please tell me you brought shackles for her wrists," Malleus intoned with impressive forbearance. Resigned to failure, the guard shook his head, suggesting, "They're just at the end of the hallway, sir. She won't go anywhere with leg shackles and us escorting her." Body stiffening, Malleus glowered at the man, saying nothing with his mouth. Acquiescent, the fat, exerted guard shrugged and walked back down the narrow hallway. Shackled to Malleus's satisfaction, Kessa was escorted down the hallway and up the stairs to the main doorway. Bright light assaulted her eyes, causing her to squint and lift her hand to provide shade. Once her eyes adjusted, she peered out at a long, wide marketplace, ending with a square-shaped, open area that was crowded with people. Through the throng, Kessa could just make out gallows across from which was another platform, curtained and much higher than the gallows. This was where important witnesses, such as the overseer and Aquina's lord, if present, would stand to observe. This platform, with its shielding curtains and prodigious height, offered excellent protection from the spectators if they became violent or antagonistic. Kessa wondered if the king was shrouded within. A large contingent of soldiers met them at the prison, and, clearing a path through the onlookers, marshaled a limping Kessa toward her execution. They halted upon seeing the king's retinue making its way over to them. Shoving past his guards, Cassius approached the prisoner. He glowered at Malleus, who was standing next to her for several moments prior to verbalizing his demand. "Back off, snake! I wish to speak to the condemned." The dungeon keeper took a single step backward, his stern demeanor daring Cassius to request he move further. Snarling his displeasure at the dungeon keeper, Cassius seized Kessa's arm and yanked her close. Last chance, Decora. Tell me where it is, and I might yet spare you the humiliation of a public execution. If the fire in Kessa's glare wasn't hot enough to scorch the king, the contempt-soaked denial, what humiliation, certainly inflamed his rage. He was about to cuff her when Malleus took a step forward. "If your highness is finished," the dungeon keeper swept a hand in the direction of the gallows, "I'm sure you don't intend to deprive the noose of its neck any longer than necessary." Cassius's eyes narrowed, but then he pivoted and proceeded to the raised platform. Upon reaching the gallows, Malleus instructed the guards to circle the structure and keep a sharp lookout. He unlocked her leg manacles and steered her up the 5 steep steps leading to the pole. Turning her to face the very vocal crowd, Malleus unrolled a scroll and waited for silence. Even Kessa noted how imposing he appeared, standing there rigidly, garbed completely in black like some fearsome gargoyle. He didn't wait long for the hush to fall. Clearing his throat, he read aloud that by order of King Cassius the Great, a title that elicited more than one jeer, Kessa Decora was sentenced to death for committing acts of theft and treason. Turning toward the executioner, Malleus suddenly closed his eyes, shaking his head and whispering something about incredible incompetence. Gesturing toward the pole, he demanded, "Where's the noose, executioner?" People began to snigger as the executioner glanced up at the pole as if he required confirmation the rope was indeed gone. Malleus saw a prepared rope down at the end of the platform and signaled to the executioner, who rushed to get it set up. Scanning the crowd, Kessa wondered if Equestria or Pantheus were among them. She hoped they wouldn't attempt a rescue. Malleus was most certainly expecting, if not hoping, for this. It was likely he had spies scattered throughout the throng, just waiting for one wrong move, and Kessa couldn't bear the thought of them falling into the dungeon keeper's clutches. Suddenly a rope was flung over her head and tightened around her sore neck. Adrenaline surged her system, causing her body to tremble and her heart to race. Gasping, Kessa tried bravely to stop shaking. "Perhaps you do have some of Equestria in you," Malleus commented as the executioner adjusted the noose. "Farewell, Miss Decora." Her brother-in-law turned away, and a black cloth bag was thrown over her head. "String her up!" she heard Cassius scream. "When you're ready, executioner," Malleus instructed unemotionally. There was a loud clank, and the ground disappeared from under her.